NBC local news in Chicago featured a 6-minute segment showing the first ever televised exorcism. The Chicago couple's home had been plagued by evil spirits, and the home desperately needed to be exorcised. But these entities weren't just a spotlight for mainstream media. They were actually tearing the Becker family apart. Edwin Becker walked into the first floor unit. A hallway door swung open, and an elderly woman stood in the doorway. She was covered in filth and held a small poodle over her shoulder. Edwin couldn't tell if the poodle was gray or a white dog because it was covered in filth as well. The old woman then began yelling and swearing at Edwin. She screamed, "We don't want you here." At the time, Edwin thought she meant we, as in her and her dog, but later he would realize that she might have been referencing someone else entirely. While the woman yelled, the real estate agent began yelling back. He said, "Myra, get your ass back in your apartment and shut up." And the old woman stepped back into the unit and slammed the door. Edwin discovered 2 hidden rooms down in the basement. He assumed one was a storage room and the other had one stored coal. The storage room had a lock on the door, so he thought there were tools or something valuable inside. When he finally broke the lock, he and his younger brother discovered the room was filled with pornography. There were videotapes and magazines all across the room, and there were shoeboxes tied with rubber bands filled with photographs. Each picture was stacked together like a collection of baseball cards. Edwin later found an antique collector and sold them the entire porn collection for $60, and he noticed whoever put up this collection also put their name on some of the strange cutouts. Many of the photos were signed with the name Ben. Edwin figured that whoever did this was mentally ill, a sexual deviant, or maybe both. He also thought that since the door had been locked with a padlock, this room could have been used to keep someone locked inside. When anything strange happened in the house, Edwin would call out to Ben's ghost. He knew that all the paranormal activity might not have been caused by Ben, but Edwin began using Ben's name as a catch-all for anything paranormal that happened in the home. After Myra had moved out of the first floor unit, Edwin began cleaning and fixing things up. One night while scrubbing the floorboards, he noticed a figure resembling a woman standing in the dark corner of the living room. She didn't move, and Edwin could barely see her face. At first he thought it was his wife, but the figure was much taller than Marcia. When he called out, "Hello," there was no response, and the entity vanished in the blink of an eye. When Edwin finished cleaning and renovating the first floor, new tenants eventually moved in, an indigenous Canadian man named Danny and his wife. At first, Danny thought Edwin was crazy. He'd heard Edwin cleaning the basement and bleaching the walls, floors, and ceiling. And when he'd go down to look, he'd see Edwin pacing around talking to himself, and down in the darkest rooms, he always sensed that he was being watched. This basement seemed to be the focal point of the paranormal energy, and Edwin would often go down there and say things like, "Ben, you old pervert, why don't you clean this place up?" He'd also tell him that generations of his family members were full of idiots and psychopaths. Danny would hear him cursing at something that he couldn't see, so he thought Edwin just had a few screws loose. But not long after moving in, Danny and his wife started experiencing strange things as well, but they thought it was just Edwin. Edwin wouldn't find out until 40 years later, but Danny's tools would often go missing, and the electricity in his unit would cut in and cut out while he was playing records. Danny blamed Edwin for stealing his tools and cutting his power. At the same time, Edwin and Marcia would hear doors slamming and furniture moving, and they just thought it was their new tenants. But over time, they both realized that the vanishing objects and the strange noises weren't from each other. Late at night, Edwin and Marcia could hear arguing coming from the first floor unit, and they thought it was their tenants. But at the same time, Danny and his wife would hear arguing coming from the second floor unit. So both couples thought they were hearing each other arguing. The disembodied voices were actually coming from empty rooms throughout the house. After Danny explained how superstitious he was, Edwin made sure to not mention ghosts around him, but strange events kept happening. So Edwin reached out to one of his friends, George, a Vietnam vet who was blind, and borrowed his high-quality tape recorder. He waited for the voices to return at night so he could capture them on tape. But right as he clicked the red button on the recorder, the voices would fall silent. Every single time he tried to record the voices, they stopped. This made Edwin believe that these spirits were intelligent entities, and the paranormal activity would vanish whenever he tried to pull out a tape recorder. Other times, Edwin kept seeing the strange woman around the property, and he figured it might have been someone staying with Danny for a while, maybe a family member he was taking care of. Edwin would often see her outside or at the foot of the stairs, but he never thought much of it. He saw her more often as weeks passed, but she always remained silent. Later, he met with his next-door neighbor, Walter, again to ask some questions about the elderly woman who had died in the house. Walter was able to describe her from memory, and his depiction matched the woman that Edwin kept seeing around the house. Meanwhile, Marcia and Edwin still argued over the paranormal activity. Even though Edwin had been a skeptic and now began to believe, he figured they were just harmless spirits. They never attacked them, so there's no reason to worry. He once saw the kitchen mixer move on its own, but if that's all the spirit could do, then why get upset? Edwin would even challenge the spirits. He would say things like, "If you can move the mixer, why not the refrigerator? That would impress me." Marcia would then scold him for encouraging the entity, but nothing ever happened. He would then call Ben lame. The lights would sometimes flicker in response. To Edwin, it seemed like a minor problem they could handle. And on top of all this, Edwin still thought the there was plenty of rational explanations for the strange things happening in the house. If there was a problem, he wouldn't quickly jump to the conclusion that it was ghosts, but Marcia took it much more seriously. Just because the paranormal activity was minor at the time didn't mean that was all they were capable of. Edwin kept dismissing the concerns, and it got to the point where Marcia couldn't take it anymore, so she packed up her things and went to stay with her parents back in Oklahoma for a while, so Edwin was left alone in the house. Sure enough, the paranormal activity escalated. At first, something took Edwin's keys. Edwin was a creature of habit and always keeping his keys in the same place, on the hook near the back door, so he was certain the spirits hid them. He later found them in the kitchen sink and noticed that the garage key had been bent 90 degrees, but he couldn't understand why the garage key was targeted. Then the gas stove would turn on at random moments, and Edwin finally saw what his wife was talking about. This was the first time they ever manipulated something dangerous. Then Edwin had a burst of anger. In frustration, he threatened to burn the entire place to the ground. He asked the spirits how they would like wandering through an empty lot forever. Soon, Danny contacted Edwin and told him they would be moving out of the first floor unit, as they were tired of listening to the screaming matches and the furniture smashing upstairs. Danny's wife had also seen a strange man in one of their bedrooms one night, but he vanished. She also noticed that the dining room chandelier would move whenever she was in the room, and she could smell burning wood coming from the basement constantly. The couple couldn't stand the paranormal activity any longer, so they moved out. After coming to the realization that these entities could be dangerous, Edwin traveled out to Tulsa and told his wife he understood her concerns and he was going to do something about it. Together, they looked through the yellow pages and found 2 ads for teams of psychic researchers. They invited both teams to the house, but Edwin could tell that they were charlatans. One of the psychics watched as the phone slowly came off the hook and left the house immediately in fear. Luckily, Edwin and Marcia later came across the psychic, Joseph DeLuise. Joseph was locally famous for his work as a psychic in Chicago, and he worked with investigators on many high-profile cases. After Edwin told Joseph what was going on in his home, Joseph sent over an author named Tom Valentine. Tom had been a reporter for the New York Times, and he investigated the Beckers in their house. After a thorough preliminary investigation, Tom ended up believing their story, so he called in Joseph, who later showed up at the house with an assistant. At first, Edwin didn't like Joseph. He had black hair and a goatee, and Edwin thought he looked more like the devil than a psychic. Edwin was skeptical of him at first, but he let him inside. Joseph looked through the living room and the bedroom, and after answering a few questions, Edwin thought Joseph was just another charlatan. But then his assistant grabbed Edwin by the wrist and said, "Bullets." After a moment of silence, she said, "In the basement." Edwin was shocked because he knew exactly what she was referring to, but he had never told anyone about it. He had once found a jar of bullets, but never discarded them. He kept them above a rafter down in the basement, and from that moment on, Edwin began to believe Joseph and his assistant were the real deal. He gave them the keys to the whole house, including the garage, and they spent the next few hours rummaging through the house. In the end, Joseph told Edwin and Marcia that multiple entities, possibly demons, had infested the home. One was a man on the first floor where Danny and his wife had lived, and Joseph said he was so powerful he wasn't even sure if he could deal with it, but he would try. Another entity was an elderly woman, and another was a younger woman that had committed suicide in the garage. Edwin told them that the neighbor Walter said she had killed herself in the basement, but Joseph told him that she had died in the garage, and her body was later moved to the basement. Joseph then left the house and contacted a Catholic priest, Joseph Wood, who had an NBC radio station. When Joseph asked if the priest could do anything to help, he said it would take a long time because he had to get permission from the archdiocese, and they needed solid proof that there was possession of the home. In the end, Joseph Wood didn't get involved. Instead, he recommended a reverend from the Independent Spiritualist Church in Chicago, William Darrell Davis, who had some experience with demons. But Edwin soon realized William and Joseph didn't always work well together. The exorcist and the medium had different philosophies. Joseph wanted to open himself up to the entity to deal with it, but the reverend believed the only way to cleanse the house was to shut himself off from the entity. The only thing they could both agree on was that the house needed to be exorcised. And just a few days before the scheduled exorcism, Edwin and Marcia were awakened by the disembodied crying of an old woman in the dining room. Meanwhile, Father Joseph Wood had contacted NBC and told them what was going on. So Carol Simpson from Chicago's WMAQ, which is owned by NBC, contacted Edwin. She asked if they could cover his story, but Edwin refused as he didn't want any exposure to the media. Edwin was afraid he would come off as crazy in the news report, and he didn't want to deal with the attention. But Joseph approached him and asked if he would allow it. Up to now, Joseph hadn't asked Edwin to pay him anything. He had been patient with Edwin and explained to him every paranormal thing that had been going on in the house, but he still hadn't asked for any money. So he said the least he could do was get him some exposure on the news. So Edwin ended up agreeing. The NBC news crew later arrived, and their work led to the first U.S. television broadcast of an exorcism.
Light out, everybody.